The Carbon Leadership Forum at the University of Washington is accelerating transformation of the building sector to radically reduce and ultimately eliminate the embodied carbon in building materials and construction. We are pioneering research, creating resources, and incubating member-led initiatives around this shared goal. This video series is a part of that effort.
I'm really pleased to introduce Amy Hatten. She is the Vice President of Corporate Sustainability at Thornton Tomasetti, a global structural engineering and et cetera firm. She is on the board of the Carbon Leadership Forum and is chair of the Embodied Carbon Network Policy Task Force. She has worked with the Carbon Leadership Forum, the USGBC, and Ceres to establish a building industry climate declaration. Amy, passing it to you.
Thanks, Kate. So what we are trying to accomplish through our interest in embodied carbon policy is obviously to mitigate climate change. But what motivates U.S. policymakers to mitigate climate change when there's a lack of leadership at the federal level? And how could climate action at the local level inform efforts toward federal climate policy? These are the questions I asked myself back in 2008, and unfortunately, I think they're still relevant today. And so I'm dusting off my thesis from the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm sharing it with you because I think it is relevant to our discussions today. We often have an uphill battle trying to get climate policies established because climate change is a predictable surprise, as coined by Bazerman and Watkins in their 2004 paper, Predictable Surprises, the Disasters You Should Have Seen Coming and How to Prevent Them. So a predictable surprise has two components. One, decision makers are aware of their approaching problem, and they know that action is required to stop it from getting worse. So I think we could say climate change certainly fits in that category. And then these authors said, why do they fail to respond in a timely manner while the problem's getting worse? They say it's because the response involves high short-term costs, although there are long-term benefits. And as we know, policymakers are very much focused on the short term and getting reelected. Also, while these problems get worse, economic systems tend to be operating effectively, and therefore there's no economic crisis creating change. And lastly, powerful minorities are benefiting from the status quo and are therefore trying to keep the status quo as it is. Despite this predictable surprise, there actually has been political action to mitigate climate change among cities and states, which is also where we're seeing early embodied carbon policies in the U.S. So to understand what motivates municipalities, I spoke with city mayors, city government staff, ICLEI, which is the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, and I read earlier studies and also theories of decision-making under uncertainty. And I compared these theories with the actual practice of early action to try to figure out what was going on. There are 4 indicators of early political action of climate change that are supported by both theory and experience. The strongest indicator that I found in my research is that municipal leaders perceive that co-benefits will come from these actions. Co-benefits offer results more immediately, and they help to solve problems on the political agenda, which tends to have a short-term focus. Mayor Doug Palmer of Trenton, New Jersey, he was a signatory of the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, saw that city problems like seniors living on fixed incomes and struggling to pay energy bills and high energy costs from inefficient municipal buildings could benefit from energy efficiency measures. He said, in Trenton, we can't decide to reduce our emissions because of the polar bears. We had to sell this to the boys in the hood. In addition to co-benefits, we also see issue champions from within the government taking advantage of open windows for policy change. In Trenton, Mayor Palmer was the issue champion, who says that he is enlightened after previously thinking climate change was a good thing because it meant less snow plowing costs. In Seattle, another city that was moving forward, it was Mayor Nichols who describes a focusing event that instigated him to take action. Mayor Nichols was the mayor who started the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, and Seattle pledged to meet the Kyoto Protocol. While not as strong an indicator as the others, internal and external shocks that provide vivid examples of the local impacts of climate change appear important in motivating action. For Mayor Nichols, his focusing event was the record low snowfall in the Cascade Mountains in 2005. No snowfall meant little water and power for the city because of the dependence on hydropower. The staff at ICLEI told me about climate change policies in Homer, Alaska, where they had experienced a bark beetle epidemic, and also in Keene, New Hampshire, where they were impacted by major floods. And lastly, political will for environmental policies among constituents seems to have an influence, but this indicator is not always present. Advocacy by citizens is not indicated as an important instigator of policy action on climate change. It actually seems more critical for policy entrepreneurs within the government to instigate a top-down approach. In Boston, the city pledged to reduce emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. When I was writing this paper, they were increasing renewables for city electricity and improving the energy efficiency of municipal buildings, and also doing a lot of other things at that time. Also, at the same time, the city public was advocating for the government to speed up its efforts to reduce fossil fuel use in certain neighborhoods. Despite this public cry, the city staff say that the attention to climate action was really brought on by several events that got Mayor Menino's attention. One of these events just seems very small, but it was important. It was when Mayor Menino was on a tour of Boston's first green building, during which a child who was also on the tour said that the building helped him to breathe easier. And that really had an impact on the mayor. Mayor Menino also saw energy efficiency and renewables as an opportunity for economic development. Surprisingly, scientific and technical information only seems to alter secondary beliefs and was not a major factor instigating action in any of the cities studied by myself and by others, such as Michelle Betzel, who wrote a paper on localizing global climate change. This is also supported by Sabatier and Wiebel in their studies of the Advocacy Coalition framework. So the recommendations from the study, which I think help us as we try to affect embodied carbon policy, include first, to help decision makers to see where there are co-benefits from policies to reduce emissions. Give decision makers best practices, have them hear from other leaders like them who have taken action, and I help them to identify items on the city agenda that would receive co-benefits. Number two is frame actions to mitigate climate change in terminology that city leaders recognize as within their field of shorter-term responsibility. One example of this kind of terminology is using risk management instead of climate mitigation. Familiar, time-tested solutions may have more resonance with leaders than new solutions. So an example when we're looking at operating energy is insulating buildings may be more resonant than new solutions. And lastly, focus less on building awareness with the public, which was sort of a new idea for me, and focus more on identifying potential policy entrepreneurs within the government who can be change agents.